So once again, thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the webinar, the second in our series. Just a few points on how we'll try and operate today, just to give you some clarity. We'll start with introductions and then have a general discussion around the topic. At any point, if you want to ask questions or you have a comment to add, please add it to the Q&A window. Camilla, who is facilitating the conversation today, will keep an eye on that and alert us as the panelists to any points that we should kind of be looking at or any questions. And then towards the end of the hour, time permitting, based on what questions have come through, we'll maybe have a more general discussion and invite anyone who has any comments or questions that they want to put to us to take the discussion from there. So to begin, let's start with some introductions. I'm Paul Hobden from Gateway. Gateway is part of Digital Frontiers Group, and we're a learning services business. So we focus on helping organizations transition from potentially traditional only face-to-face training into utilizing the affordances of online to enhance their capacity building. So that's me. I'm going to now ask our second panelist to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the Global Director for Member Engagement and Learning at Humentum. Humentum is a nonprofit organization that focuses on strengthening the operational capability and capacity of development and humanitarian organizations around the world. We do a lot in the learning and training space, all digitally now, but historically we've done that digitally and in person, so I'm interested in exploring that. And my background is largely in the digital and online learning space, and in the private sector, the academic sector, and now in the nonprofit and humanitarian sector. I'm glad to be here. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me.
Thanks very much, Chris. And then to Elke.
Hi, I'm Elke Jahns. I teach at the Fletcher School, which is the Graduate School of International Relations at TUFTS University in Boston. And I've been working as the connection between DFI and TUFTS for the past several years, and I manage some of the coaches for one of the foundation courses at DFI.
Thanks, Elke. And Tom?
Thanks, Paul. Good morning. I'm Tom Sinclair, and I'm the Chief Digital Learning Officer at Gateway. So I work with Paul on Gateway. Gateway is was a project of CGAP that merged with Digital Frontiers, and as we were incubating that project at CGAP with the World Bank, I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with Chris in shaping that. So Gateway, as Paul said, is an end-to-end learning service. We work with international development organizations, so multilaterals, bilaterals, foundations, really helping them understand how to do digital learning.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tom. So yeah, I mean, I think to kick off is the question, how's the last 6 months been in terms of your experiences of trying to navigate this new world in terms of education? Chris and Elke, I'm sure it's had a massive impact on what you guys are doing and how you've been able to respond.
Yeah, well, and as Chris mentioned in our conversation earlier, there hasn't been a lot of blended learning right now, if that's the topic today, because we've all been online. It's been interesting, but I think people have also adapted, and I think we've been surprised at some of the benefits that have come out of this. And when we go back, I think we will go back to in-person learning, but with an online component. And there's some openings there that maybe we hadn't thought of before.
And have you actually started to go back onto campus now?
We at Fletcher have not, but some of the other schools at Tufts have. So it's been very much a department by department basis. We have so many international students that we wanted to make sure that they weren't excluded because of visa restrictions or travel restrictions. So we decided to be all online this semester. We're still debating what happens next semester.
Okay. And Chris, your take?
Yeah, I would say, similar to what Elke said, I think largely, there have been some some surprising positives I think people did not anticipate, right? And I feel like I've, for 20, 25 years been trying to move people to becoming more digital and kind of swimming against that current. And it's amazing to see how all the obstacles that people would claim that were there sort of, disappear overnight when the environment changed so drastically. But I don't think it's just about being forced. I think we're in a space now that we weren't even 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the technology, in terms of the tools to be able to support it, in terms of lower barriers to entry, more accessible, both in terms of price and functionality, in terms of the tools that are available. The ability to really think about a blend of synchronous and asynchronous, which I hope we were able to talk a bit about today, and to think about time differently, right? So we had, a 3-day conference, which we've pivoted into a 9-month online event. We have, a 3-day face-to-face course, which we turned into a synchronous online course over the same period of time. So suddenly you have the ability to not be constrained in terms of how you think about time. And I think that's a real advantage, and we can talk a little bit later about why I think that's an advantage as we go back, because I think we want to go back and be much more thoughtful about it than maybe the environment we were in before. So I'm hopeful and optimistic.
Thanks, Chris. Tom, what's your experience and your thoughts on this sort of last 7-8 months?
Yeah, I think absolutely we've seen clearly a forcing function of people needing to go online. And I think Chris is absolutely right that it's not just what happened. We were actually set up to do it, which is fantastic. What we saw, and we're still seeing, but seeing less and less of it, was this sort of immediate need to fill, I have already planned out my event and I need to get this event done. And I think we saw a lot of shoehorning into things that didn't work really well, right? In other words, you saw all day long conferences on Zoom, which is not what you want to do. And so I'm pleased to hear Chris's example of how they have taken something that was supposed to be in a shorter period of time and moved that over a number of months. I think we're starting to see that more and more now. And I think that's sort of what we're all trying to do, is convince people that there's better ways to do it than just sort of trying to replicate what was in person online.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, as we move back to hopefully to a place where we can start to do things in person, the topic of today's discussion really is coming to the forefront. Is this idea of now we're going to put more emphasis on blending, on blended learning. I think one of the questions to start with is that, do we really have the right understanding and definition of blended? And I suppose for us to discuss this today is really to get an understanding of what do we mean when we say blended learning. Chris, chatting before, and you had some views on this. I don't know if you want to share those.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think about it. I do think it's a tricky word. I think it's a simple word to use, but it's a complex word to understand. And I don't know that the goal should be that we all have one common definition of it. And even in the discussion we were having before we started, like depending on your use case and depending on the environment you're in, how you may think about blend is different. But the way I think about it is to move us away from just sort of thinking about the binary decision about the delivery channel. Is something delivered online or is it delivered in person? Yes, that is one dimension of the way you can sort of think about the blend. But there are so many other dimensions that you can sort of think about, right? So one of them is, is all the learning happening at the same time? Is it synchronous, or is it, are there asynchronous components, or is it all of one or all of the other? Like that's another spectrum around which you can think about the blend. And that, by the way, can be happening whether it's in person or online. A second one, and you mentioned this, I think we were talking earlier, is like, oh, what's the role? Is it a facilitator-led experience? Is it a self-led experience? Is it a peer-led experience? Or is it something in between? So that's another slider, essentially, you can move in terms of the blend. There are others that I could mention, right? The blend between reflective learning and active learning. The blend between conceptual and applied, right? And another one might be the emotional or affective aspect of learning versus the cognitive kind of knowledge that we need to acquire. So, you could keep making these, but I think as we're sort of thinking about experiences and as we're thinking about going back, like mapping the types of activity, the types of engagement we want to have, the types of ways we want to see people show up in the learning experience, and thinking about what that blend is, and then saying, okay, so for this set of things, is online the better environment, is in person the better environment, or vice versa. You can still have a very blended learning experience and be primarily one or primarily the other, if you break out of that mold of thinking just about the delivery channel.
That's very interesting, Chris. Elke, what's your kind of thinking around blended learning been? What's your take on what it means, what it is, and what people are talking about?
So I like that a lot, Chris, of you're taking a step back and thinking about, well, what do we really want people to get out of this component or that component? And then think about, well, what's the best way to get there? And rather than having the technology drive your decisions, but think about, well, what are my goals? And maybe this part really is best in person, but this part actually is not just okay online or cheaper online, but actually might be better online, because students have more time to reflect and think about both the material they're taking in, but also the responses they're posting. So being very conscious of those decisions. So yeah, I've been using, I didn't call it that, but I guess I've been using blended learning for years. Actually, since I started working with DFI, I was then like, oh, maybe I can bring some of this into my own in-person classroom in a way that actually engages learners differently and engages different kinds of learners. I'll stop there. I can come back to some of that later.
I mean, I think, and I'll be interested to see whether this is kind of, Tom has seen this as well, in speaking to people and clients and the like. I think people are kind of colloquially referring to blending at the moment really as simply that we'll do some in person and some online, and not thinking kind of more broadly about the idea of all of the aspects and how you select around all of that. And to your point, Elke, I think that education has always been blended. There's always been elements that you had to do on your own, and there's been elements that you could do with a facilitator and elements that you did with peers. So like blending has always been part of it, but I suppose the new entrant into it is the digital component. Tom, I don't know what your view is.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We've been thinking about how you get learning across in the classroom or in a facilitated session or whatever it is. We think about the best way to do that. And of course, online, we should think about the best way to do that. There's not just one delivery method. Again, it's not just let's go to Zoom and try to recreate what's there. The challenge, Paul, I know you know this well, that we're having is working with clients in the international development sector who aren't there yet, right? And trying to convince them that they need to think differently. There are a few reasons for that. One is right now there's just a little bit, again, of panic. How do I get this across? Driven by a number of things. How do I spend my budget? How do I reprogram things? And there's also, I think, a little bit of this subject matter expert sage on the stage sort of component in our field that's still there, right? And so if we're thinking about really changing this up and really being blended and really thinking about different types of components, where does that person fit in? And I think that there's still a space there, but I think it just changes the dynamics. And I think the donors we're working with right now are slower to get there.
I think there's another dimension, if I could chime in, Paul, that dawned on me as I was listening to Elke speak as well, is are you thinking about a blend of a particular lesson, like one topic that you're trying to cover, or you think about a blend in a much more macro sense, right? So if you're an organization and you're thinking about a particular group of people that you want to have, a learning or professional development track for several months or a year, how you think about that blend is very different than you think about one event. Or if you're at a university, you think about it differently. Like I recall, so prior to doing this, I was at Cornell University in the US, and I remember having conversations with the deans and trying to get them to understand that one of the they had two competing priorities, right? They really wanted students to have an international experience. They wanted them to go outside the US for a semester and learn and study. The problem was that the way the traditional in-person scheduling was that some classes were only offered in this semester or were offered in this semester every other year. And if it was required for your core, you couldn't miss that to then be out of country, right? So it's like, oh, how do you then put some of these things online so that you can reach your goals of actually having more students off the campus when you wanted them off the campus for work experiences, international learning experiences, different kinds of exchanges. So that's blended at a much more macro level. So I think you also, and I think this is the point, you know, talking to donors, Tom, is like, how do you get people to think about, like, at what level are they trying to solve this for, right? Are you trying to solve it at the individual SME learner level? Are you trying to solve it at the institutional level? Or even trying to solve it at some broader, like, you know, multiple institutions, sector-wide level? And the blend can start to feel and look differently depending on clarifying, like, oh yeah, what design problem am I working on and what level am I at?
In your experience, I mean, it may be different to mine, but it almost feels that often the reluctance to adapt or to change or to experiment is almost partially driven by the belief that the in-person is superior to anything else. Have you had similar experiences, or was that kind of an isolated experience that I've had?
Well, I think there are places where that is still the case, and I think you're seeing it with universities right now as they again scramble to do this because they don't know how to do it. And I think that's the key. It's the quality of how you do this, how you bring in different components to get learning across in different ways to people who learn differently, how you use, well, right now it's all online, but how you might use some online and some in person. But yes, I think when you're looking right now, this is a broad statement, but I'll say it, at how universities, at least in the US, are doing online learning quickly, moving things online. You're seeing not the best quality, and so therefore it's not quite a one-to-one.
And to come back to Tom's point, I think that is really crucial, this idea that if you're moving something that used to be in person online, the idea is not to replicate that activity. The idea is to take a step back and say, okay, what was the goal of this activity? What was the purpose of this activity? What are we hoping that the students would get out of this? Now, how could we create that online? So rather than just, okay, this thing, we're going to now put that exact same thing online, and right, that ends up with a lot of really long Zoom calls. You know, maybe that's not the best way to do it. So like we have some activities, we have an activity at Fletcher, the faculty and staff wait on the students. They serve dinner to the students, and it's this big fundraiser and all that. And so obviously that wasn't going to work very well online. But if we tried to say, okay, I don't know, we'll order food and send it to your house, like, but if we then took a step back and said, okay, what was the purpose of this? Well, the purpose of this was this fun kind of role reversal of, you know, changing the power dynamics, also the purpose of the fundraiser and supporting a cause that the Fletcher students agreed on. So are there other ways to get at that? Well, there are all kinds of other ways to get at that kind of thing, right? We could do a quiz show where we quiz the students, quiz the faculty on things. And, you know, so just taking a step back, what was the purpose of this activity? What are the learning goals from this activity? Now, how can we do that online? And we may come up with all kinds of fun, creative things that are new openings that we couldn't have had before.
I mean, I think that's a strong sentiment coming across from everyone, is the idea is if you just try and mirror what was being done in person online, that's not going to work. Which then leads to the question, well, what are the strengths of online that can be used, and what are the real strengths of in-person that are lost? And when we go to blending, that's what we should focus on in person. Have you got any feelings around, and like, this is really important in person versus this is really effective digitally?
I mean, I'm actually going to make the case for in-person first, even though that's not what maybe people would expect from me. I think there's a few things that even in the prior world, even before COVID, by not thinking critically the way we were just talking about, and I love Elke's example about like stepping back and saying, why were we even doing this event? What was the why behind the why? Is I think there are some things that online honestly still really struggles with, right? One of them is language, right? I was just talking to one of my work colleagues here today, 2 days ago, about something she was doing, something else she was doing online, and reminding me, there were 27 languages in Namibia, there were 43 languages in Kenya, right? That online has not really dealt well with 2 languages, let alone 27 languages in the same learning experience. And I believe we can. I believe the technology will get there. But for an organization to decide that they're going to cascade and roll out a face-to-face program around the world in English only, or maybe English, Spanish, French, right? You're missing an opportunity to kind of sustain and meet your learning population where it actually is. Is it complicated? Is it more expensive? Yeah, there may be a whole bunch of dimensions, but that is easier to do when you think about in-person. The second one is relationships. We all know that relationships can be made online, and I'll be the first person to say, I think there's a lot of things you can do with social learning that often get left off the table, right? So I'm not saying that you cannot do social learning, but if you're going to bring people together, design the experience to take advantage of the fact that you've got people together to really strengthen long, slow, deep learning at the relationship level, right? So to me, it's not that, oh, in-person does that better. In-person does that differently. So why would you just bring people together, throw them together just to feed them a whole bunch of content, when really you should be bringing them together to really strengthen those relationships? And then the third is this experiential element, right? How do you use that in person, if you're going to invest in it and invest in the cost of it, to really get that kind of common shared transformational experience, right? Again, which to me is not about content. So what I hope goes away after all of this is that we don't have any more, especially in the international development and humanitarian sectors, have in-person trainings simply to force feed content on people, right? Because there are lots of really bad online that can do that way less cost effectively than really bad in person. So let's not replace one with the other. If we're going to say, let's bring people together, it's like, oh, how do we go deeper on some of those other elements? That to me is the role of in person. I'll throw that to the group to gnaw on or disagree.
The point that we can come back to, because I'll be interested in Elke and Tom's view, is around this relationship one, because I think that's often the one that's brought in face-to-face or in person. It's this idea that we build relationships, we somehow learn some sense of soft skills by being physically in the same place as people. And I'd like to really challenge the thinking around that. And the thinking around that going forward, do we not need to be as deliberate in acquiring the skills to build relationships digitally as we need to acquiring the skills to build relationships in person? So, I mean, I'd like to pick up that as we come back. Elke, from your experience, what do you feel are the kind of strengths of in-person versus the strengths of digital?
So certainly the things that Chris mentioned, and I think we do have to be really deliberate to form those relationships, those networks, even more so when we're online. And that is the thing people say that they miss the most about in person, is sort of for us, we all in the offices, you always talk about the chatting around the water cooler. For some reason, that's where everybody congregates. And that's where you have the informal conversations that are a lot harder to manage online, because you can't just turn to the person next to you and say, hey, how was your weekend? And breakout groups, help, chat threads help, but that sort of informal interaction is a lot harder to manage online. And that's something, so I have been that was something we were really worried about when we went to online this semester, was, gosh, everybody comes to Fletcher because the Fletcher community, the Fletcher, the relationships you build there is a huge part of the experience. How are we going to do that? And so put a lot of energy into community building online. A lot of how do we humanize each other and share something beyond this is my resume, you know. So I do activities with discussion boards. I had them introduce themselves and share something about yourself that we wouldn't guess, and post a related photo. And, you know, gosh, I learned, you know, people in my class, they do watercolor, they do water skiing. 5 different people from 5 different countries have all bungee jumped off the same bridge in South Africa. Like, how there are these fun connections that come up that way, but it's something I work on anyway in person, but you have to make an extra effort to do that online, and to allow for, you know, maybe some of that is group work that happens outside of the classroom, where they kind of set up their own things. I think you do have to do a lot of small group interaction opportunities. So that part has been the biggest challenge for me. I can then go back and talk about benefits of being online, but stop there.
And in terms of the, Tom, before I come back to both Elke and Krista, anything from your side in terms of those affordances?
I think they covered it really well. I would emphasize the human touch, the human element, though. I do think you can build relationships online. I do think that younger people are much more able and willing to do it. I think it's different, Paul, and I think we're going to talk more about this, but I think it's different than building soft skills. I think you can do some of that online, but the human element, the experiential element of learning, I think is kickstarted and really concentrated if you can get together in person.
I want to keep going on this thread of relationships because I think it's a very complex, nuanced thing, right? And I certainly want to make clear that I've more of my experiences with asynchronous learning than synchronous, and I think there are so many opportunities for really structured peer learning online that don't exist in person. So, but I'm also amazed. I just finished a 3-week experience, you know, meeting with a group of people for 2 hours over 3 weeks that I'd never met any of them before. And I'm amazed at the level of deep sharing that occurred in those 3 sessions, right? I mean, this was a topic which encouraged us all to be vulnerable. There were great facilitators. I feel like, you know, I got to know those people in a matter of 6 hours online over 3 weeks, and to the point that we all were comfortable as being quite vulnerable with each other. What's missing, and this is where, you know, I think we have to kind of keep thinking about how to do it, is, you know, had that experience happened in person, you would have been able to go so much deeper with some of those individuals, you know, in the coffee break, you know, outside in the evening, you know, whatever. And part of it is just the pace of like the post-COVID world, but also just the structure of it. It's like, oh, that was the 2-hour block when I'm being vulnerable about this topic with this group of people, right? Boom, that ends. And it's like, okay, on to the next thing. And that doesn't feel like, and it's also felt like it's a bit of a structured place. It's like, oh, right. So I have a relationship with you in here, but am I supposed to acknowledge that relationship with you outside of this space? Whereas I think if we had met in person, we would have. So I think as designers of online experiences, I think the barrier that most people think is there is, can you get people to relate to each other and talk about difficult topics online? I think the barrier has been cleared. I think the answer is yes. I think it's this more informal nature of extending that to longer term relationships, the stuff that you're struggling with at Fletcher. I think that's the next frontier of social learning and relationship learning on an online space.
Chris, I mean, I think that speaks a bit to Elke's point, is that some of those things kind of happen naturally, and if you put a group of people together in a space that they socialize, that's kind of in their nature. So you don't have to be as deliberate when you're designing an in-person experience. It's not as comfortable online. One is an anecdotal thing, is that speaking to someone who's run in-person training for 50 years and forced to do stuff very low tech digitally, their experience has been, and again, in an area where people kind of have to share personal experiences and become quite vulnerable, is that their feeling is that the depth of conversation in the digital world that has been deeper. it's almost that it's freed people from some sort of inhibition, and they've actually experienced an advantage of it. That is different to the, well, what are the relationships like longer term, and can they sustain? But in terms of just the discussion, definitely a depth there. My other question is there a generational issue? That, you know, is it a case of, if I look at my teenage children, they most probably are more comfortable taking a relationship that they've had digitally to a deeper level than I am, because it's just not something I was comfortable with. Do you think we're going to see a generational shift?
I do. Yes, you know, I mean, your example is exactly right, and I think of young people who play. You know, I think gaming is a huge place where people build relationships, and they play with people around the world they've never met. I mean, that's not a very deep relationship, maybe, but it certainly is a comfort level that I think older people have. For the record, that I think being in person with people, there is still something that you cannot, you can never replicate it completely. I do think you can go further, and I think the examples we heard certainly point to that. Yeah, so that's heartening, but I do think that there's something about being with people in person.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, sorry if I could jump in. So yes, I mean, I think in general, younger people have been doing more and more online already, and yes, the gaming, the other ways of interacting, there's a lot of that. I want to make sure that we don't, you know, overgeneralize or discount. So I teach at the Lifelong Learning Institute at Tufts, and those are all people in their 70s and 80s. And when this thing happened in March, all the classes moved online. And I was amazed how people jumped up and embraced it. And those same people, they're having regular Zoom meetings with their grandkids. And in this case, yes, it was, many of those people were forced into this, and this might not have been their first choice, but they jumped into it. Yeah, so what is this chat thread thing? Okay. And boy, they were jumping all over the chat thread, right? So it's, again, if that's filling a need, if it's helping people do something they couldn't otherwise do, then people will jump up.
One of my questions is that one of the experiences of any in-person facilitation workshop is access to the expert. You know, there's just that feeling that I was in the same room as this person, that I could ask them a question, I could get a sense of them. Do you think it's possible to effectively replicate that online?
Well, I'll jump in, because yesterday in our class, we had 3 amazing guest speakers who came to talk to my class, who could never have shown up in, you know, Medford, Massachusetts for one afternoon class, but they were all right there. And so in that sense, there's more access. It's different. Again, I'm not going to go up after class and pat them on the shoulder and, you know, buddy in that kind of informal way, but that people had access to somebody they might not have had access to at all. And things like office hours, meetings. So I'm having all these great one-on-one office hours with students online. Now I had them anyway, but now I can offer them at a bigger range of times. I can do just one sometime if somebody needs to have a meeting. I don't have to worry about commuting. So in some ways, access has increased.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree with everything Elke just said there. I think what people think about as access before was quite exclusive, actually. You know, both the facilitator and the participants had to have the time and the money and the space to be able to convene in that particular point. And there have just been so many examples, I think, over the last 6 or 8 months where access to thought leaders and decision makers and leaders across all different industries and sectors has been increased. And again, I think you have to have some intentionality. It's not just access. If it's, you know, one person in a Zoom with 7,000 people, I wouldn't call that access. But I think the kind of example that we just heard about having to have 3 guest speakers in a class that they could never have justified, like that investment for a 1-hour conversation. There's so much of that, and so I think, you know, that concept should be, we should be able to put that concept aside now. It's like, yes, we should be able to give people access to experts in so many different ways through the online medium.
Paul, could I just jump in? I agree with Elke and Chris, absolutely. But I do want to point out, as we all know, that and maybe it was the word access that really made me want to bring this up, that not everyone has great internet access or accessibility to devices. And that's certainly true in the places where we work. And so we have to clearly take that into account as we're thinking about doing blended learning, how we create access, because the opportunity to show up at a conference or to go to a training when it's not there is not easily replicated in those low bandwidth environments.
Mm-hmm. So,
Right,
and
but
on that same point of access there, because that's one of my big concerns in my teaching is, am I inclusive? Who's being included? Who's being excluded? So not just that kind of access, but also literacy. You know, how well do people write? If a lot of online learning involves a lot of typing, a lot of posting discussions, a lot of that, who are we leaving out there? That the point about languages was very clear. I mean, you know, many of our DFI students, English is their second, third, fourth language. It's not the language they feel most comfortable writing and engaging professionally in. So what are our concerns there?
yeah, I feel like I got some strong opinions on this topic too. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Tom, and you know, I think I've chatted about this before. So I think on the whole, right? Yes, not everyone has access to the right device or the right bandwidth, but I think on the whole, online digital learning expands access, because so often the same people we're talking about who don't have access to those devices are probably not the communities that would have been included had we decided to do an in-person event. And so I think just because of decisions about access, you know, physically, decisions about cost of getting the facilitator there, locating a room. So I think it's an easy red herring to say, well, not everyone's going to have access to a device. Yes, that's true. But if we had run this event, would we have gone to that community or that country or whatever and done that face-to-face event? And the answer in many cases is the answer would have been no. And then I think we have to think very intentionally about the issues that Elke is raising is, yes, literacy, yes, languages. So I think those are all real factors. I think in the more we do things digitally, the more both the tech space, the technology platform providers, as well as whoever's running the event, the facilitators and the content experts, you know, need to think about those issues from an inclusivity standpoint. But I do question whether or not digital is actually by default leaving people behind. I think there's the risk that it goes to a common denominator of a certain format, a certain language, the preponderance on the written word. And I think that is challenging from an inclusivity standpoint. So I think it's a topic.
I mean, it's slightly off topic, but Chris, to your point, in South Africa, one of the private higher education institutions which caters to kind of fairly people that are economically struggling, they actually see a physical location as a barrier because the cost of transport to get to that physical location is greater than the data cost of getting the content. So that access question is an interesting one. Back to the issue of blending. I mean, for me, I think I'd be really interested to get your views. Two of the real affordances of digital are flexibility. So, you know, I control my time, I control my access, I can manage my kind of schedule and all of that, and scale. you know, you can get thousands of people doing a course. Versus, I mean, we've spoken of the in-person, that idea of relationships. You in a space with people, you build these deep relationships. And the other one that I sometimes think we forget about is the opposite of flexibility. It's focus. It's the fact that for these 3 weeks, these 2 days, this is all I'm going to do, which does lead to a different experience. So how do you see the ability to kind of blend across these benefits when you're constructing an experience? And how do you make that work? Where you made a very good point earlier that, you know, time is a strange constraint. Ken Robinson always talks about like this production line of education, that like a date becomes the unifying thing. Like, how do we move away from that yet retain this idea of kind of focus?
I'll pick up on that last word. I'll maybe start with the focus. You know, one of the models that I like, and I can put the link in the chat even, I think, is the Neuro Leadership Institute's AGIS model, right? And the one of the issues, you know, so A is attention and S is spacing, right? And so I think when we get to those two things confused, right, is in terms of how our brain works, is when things get tripped up. So yes, the fact that we all have to be in this place at this time gives us a certain amount of focus. What we know about how the brain works, though, is it's not going to be very good to sort of focus that intensely on consuming lots of content for 3 hours or 3 days at all ends. But it is really good, back to what we were talking about, for having those kinds of transformative common experiences, right? So that's, to me, like how you could use that focus. And then the flexibility, as kind of the flip side of that coin, works really well for the delivery and the ability to kind of drip content to people and put them in control about how fast or how slow they can kind of absorb that content or go back to it or look at it again. So again, I think that makes more sense when you're looking at a kind of more holistic, comprehensive learning experience than, say, replacing a specific course, right? Because then you've got limited landscape to work with. But when you're talking about, you know, a certificate program or a leadership development program or a degree program, you have a lot more flexibility to work with, flexibility and focus.
So a lot of what you're talking about, Chris, is what we use. We're talking more about that in higher ed, the idea of the flipped classroom model, where the sort of traditional model is you all come to class and I'm going to lecture at you, right? Throw content at you. And then you're going to go home and do the actual learning, which is when you apply those theories to a new case, you do homework, you do group work, you grapple with this stuff. And so the flipped classroom model is basically, let's flip that. You get all the content ahead of time by doing the readings ahead of time, by an asynchronous recorded lecture, by those kinds of things. And then when we get to the classroom, then let's do the real learning. Then let's split into groups and apply this theory to this situation. Let's start you working on those problem sets, but we're all here to talk through them together. And so that's a very, you know, that's something that really lends itself very well to blended learning. And I think that, you know, some of my colleagues have said students come to class understanding the material better than they did when they left the class before, because now they've already got it and now we really get to grapple with it. And that's the hard stuff, and that's where you want the facilitator there to help. So that's kind of exciting. I haven't completely flipped, but I'm trying to flip more and more. Not flip out, just flip.
Okay, I'm with you on that. We've been fairly pleased with our attempts to kind of move to a kind of problem-based approach, which again, very similar. The only difference is we stating the problem right up at the front, then asking you to go and independently, here's the resources to kind of get familiar with, and then together we solve that problem. And again, it works well in the blended environment. So here's my question to the panel as we kind of head to the last few minutes, and happy to take some questions, is that where do you see us in a year's time, 18 months time, when we back to some type of normal, new normal, whatever that is, and we have access to do capacity building. We can fly consultants into cities to run courses. We can have students back on campus. Do you think we are going to have learned any lessons, or do you think we're going to end up back where we were 3 years ago, doing the same things? Okay, you're shaking your head, so I'll start with you.
We've been spoiled by some things that I don't think we're going to want to let go of again. So I hope we're not flying people all over the place when they don't need to be flown all over the place. I mean, that's not good for our planet, just for, among other things. Yeah, I mean, hopefully we're having these really thoughtful conversations about, hey, what actually works better online? Let's keep that. And what works in person. And then as you all have said, yes, if bringing people together is a precious thing, then let's not use that as just here, now I'm going to just bombard you by throwing, by lecturing at you. How do we use that more deliberately?
Tom, where do you see us?
Yeah, I share that, Elke. I hope that we're very intentional about travel, and I think one of the things that will force us to be intentional about that is the fact that a lot of people have some budget surplus because they weren't able to spend their travel budget this year. That's just one sort of practical thing. But I do think we've also learned a lot. But we have to be very intentional not to sort of slide back into models that are comfortable, and really be intentional about how we blend this synchronous, asynchronous, in person, online, and really have some good examples to show, because there is, sort of going back to the beginning of the conversation, there are some bad examples that I think people saw. I think just in our own homes, we're seeing some people are seeing some bad examples of learning online. Some people are seeing some great examples. But I think it's being intentional about highlighting those really good ways of doing that. Yeah, that's my hope.
Chris, your crystal ball?
Yeah, I don't have much, I think, new to add. I mean, at Humentum, we're making a very intentional decision. We're not flipping back. That there won't be some valuable in-person stuff, but we're going to be quite intentional about that. So the large part of our delivery portfolio that was in person, we're not going back to that. Like, that's done at this point, for all the reasons that Elke and Tom said. I do think the rush to Zoom as the tool of choice, because for good reason. It was accessible. You could access it easily. You could kind of keep your face-to-face pedagogy and kind of do it the same. I think the new normal is going to have to be more creative about the different sets of tools that we have, and more thoughtful about all those other elements of blending that we were sort of talking about at the beginning of the session. I think it will matter a lot, though, in environments. I'm sure universities will look different than professional learning. I've got a 14-year-old daughter, so K-12 in the US is gonna, some of that is gonna go back to normal, but some of it isn't. I mean, I live in the northern part of the country. It snows here a lot, and the head of the school said probably snow days are a thing that aren't gonna happen anymore. We're not gonna close school because the weather is bad. We're gonna do school online. So that's just a subtle little thing, but it's going to be quite, I think that if we can manage to do it for a month or 6 months or a year, certainly we can figure out how to do it for a day as part of the curriculum going forward. So I think, every sector is going to wrestle with, like, what did we learn from this that we can build into kind of having more resiliency actually going forward as well.
I think my experience anecdotally through my children is that they just won't accept the things that they were forced to accept 8 months ago for no reason. There were things that happened that had no reason. Now we've seen an alternative, and I suspect the same will be with whether it's corporate training. People saying, "Well, I don't want to spend a week away from home, and I don't have to," and students saying, "Well, why can't I get this online? Why do I have to do?" So I think there will also be some push from, for want of a better term, the market or the participants, not just what's being driven by us as the kind of the educators. As a final piece of advice, everyone has said, well, we need to be intentional about this blending and thoughtful on it. If you were to give people on this webinar and people listening afterwards one practical piece of advice as they kind of now move towards blending, what would it be? Tom, maybe I'll start with you.
I think maybe thinking about it within your own context, within your own organization, through a change management process, right? And you already have a lot to build on. We have some great examples, but again, thinking about it very intentionally, bringing in the people who will be affected by it. Focusing on your stakeholders, on your leadership, to sort of a traditional change management sort of process as would be an interesting way, a good way, I think, to be intentional about making sure that those things take hold in your learning and your organization.
Thanks, Tom. Elke, from your side?
You didn't warn me you were going to ask this.
Sorry.
I feel like a lot of what we talked about is there, but yeah, like being really careful about what are the strengths of each of these different choices, and then being very deliberate about that. Does it make sense to do this in person? Who are we including? Who are we leaving out by doing it this way? If we are in person, are we using the strength of being in person? And when we're online, who are we including? Who are we leaving out that way? And what is actually better online? Great, let's milk that. So really play to the strengths of each of them.
Thanks. Okay. Chris, from yourself?
I would say I'm going to add two things to what they already added. I would say one is look outside of learning and training and education. We essentially live blended digital lives already. And there's all kinds of interesting examples if you just look at how other services are delivered that might give you inspiration to how to do something different. And then the second is ask for help for people who have been doing this for a long time. What I was really struck by over the last 6 months, and for example, again, my daughter's school district, is how much they're trying to figure it out on their own with a whole bunch of people who've only done one way of learning for the last 25 years. And then telling the community, hey, we're experimenting. No, you don't need to experiment and make the same mistakes that I've made, that Elke's made, that Tom's made. Like, we learned from those mistakes. There's plenty of people out there who have this expertise. And I think in the rush to move everything on Zoom, we didn't connect that expertise as much with areas where it's needed. And I think, if you're going down this journey, there are plenty of people to help you do that. Don't recreate those same mistakes.
I think that's invaluable advice. And I think I would also go back to a point Elke brought up right at the beginning, which is, for me, what we see often is that people start from the position of, this is the content that we have, as opposed to, why are we doing this? What's the outcome we're looking for? So for me, you've got to go right back to that outcome. And if you get that outcome right, then it becomes easier to select the right channel, the right digital versus in person. You can find the right people to help you. That brings us to the end of the hour. I want to thank all the panelists for their time and their input. Really do appreciate your experience and your wisdom and your knowledge in this area. We wish you the best of luck for the rest of this year and into the new academic year. To those people that have joined us on the webinar, thank you very much for joining us. We hope that you've enjoyed it. There will be a recording made available of this. You have the contact details of Camilla and myself. If there's any questions, or you want to get in touch with anyone, please drop us an email and we'll be able to help facilitate that. Thank you all very much. Have a good day and a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.